Greetings. My name is Dr. Rich Turner. Welcome to Daniel chapter 1, lesson 2. By way of reminder, these lessons are being recorded for the benefit of my Sunday school members when they miss Sunday school. In the lessons, we will have the content that I plan to discuss that day. What we will miss is all of the interaction, and a lot of times the discussion will go into other areas that I had not planned. Again, that's the way the Spirit of God works. So as you review these lessons, you will have the planned content, although you may be missing things that actually happened in the class itself. So Daniel chapter 1, lesson 2. By way of reminder, we said that if Daniel was 17 years old when he went into Babylonian captivity in 605 BC, he would have been born roughly 622 BC, would have died around 530 BC, lived to at least right around 90 years old. This does put Daniel contemporary with Ezekiel, who went into captivity on the second wave, as well as Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. So that gives you an idea of where Daniel fits in to the Bible chronologically. This is just an overview of the Babylonian Empire at its peak under Nebuchadnezzar. This includes not only areas of absolute control, but areas of influence like Egypt. As you can see, the Babylonian Empire had expanded across the Middle East there. And by way of reminder, 3 sieges against Jerusalem that resulted in 3 waves of captivity being taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. As a crow flies, that distance is 500 miles. So once you factor in trade routes, the march from Jerusalem to Babylon could have been as much as 900 miles. There is no doubt people perished on this journey. Little artist rendition of the city of Babylon. You can see the northern palace, the southern palace, and then various temples. It's said that Nebuchadnezzar restored, I think, 13 different temples. You can see gates. Those gates are named after false gods as well. So a very pagan city. You can see the river, the Euphrates River goes through the city, and you can see they've actually siphoned off the river, and there's actually a moat that was built around the city. This is the largest, the most beautiful, quite possibly the wealthiest city of its day in 600 BC. It is a very pagan city. There's the Edamanaki that we talked about last week. This is a different artist rendition of the city of Babylon. You have the northern palace here, the southern palace here. You have the processional way through the Ishtar Gate. We'll talk more about that. There's the Edamanaki, that stepped to ziggurat with the, again, scholars tell us the only thing that Nebuchadnezzar did was he built that blue temple to Marduk on the top of the Edamanaki. This is an artist's rendition of what possibly Babylon looked like from the Euphrates. Again, absolutely beautiful, a wealthy city. You can see the blue bricks. We looked at those last week. We'll look at them again. Probably the entire Edamanaki was not like that, just the temple on top. But you can see the gold, absolutely gorgeous. Worshipping all types of false gods, absolutely pagan. But this was the city where Daniel and his friends were taken captive, and others. A different view of sort of the north palace, the southern palace, the Ishtar Gate, the processional way. You can see the blue there, and there's the Edamanaki. There's the Euphrates River. And that is the Ishtar Gate, and we'll look more at that right now. There's the Edamanaki. This is a rebuild of the Ishtar Gate in the Pergamon Museum in Germany. Absolutely gorgeous. You can see the 3 different animals there on the gate. And inside this area is an inscription that was made by Nebuchadnezzar. It says, in part, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the faithful prince, appointed by the will of Marduk, the highest of the princely princes. Again, Marduk was the patron god of Babylon, but Nabu was Nebuchadnezzar's god. And you can see where he says that next. Beloved of Nabu, of prudent counsel, who has learned to embrace wisdom, who fathomed their divine being and reveres their majesty, the wise, the humble, the caretaker of Esgalia, the processional way, and Esdia, the firstborn son of Nabopolassar, that was his father, the king of Babylon. That's an inscription in the Ishtar Gate. This is a rebuild of the Ishtar Gate by the man who spent most of his life there doing the work in Babylon, the excavation work. That's a mock-up of the Ishtar Gate, Robert Caldaway. This is a rebuild of the processional way. You can see the lines with the wings, and you can see the beautiful blue bricks, the flowers. It was absolutely gorgeous. And again, they had an annual celebration where they would go down the processional way through the Ishtar Gate into the city. So Daniel walked this many, 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 many times. Again, the city was surrounded by 40-foot walls. This was a powerful, amazing city. This is the pagan place where Daniel has been taken captive. So let's get to our text. Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. In the year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those, the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. The first thing that jumps out as you read Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 is really the historicity of this book, the reality that it's rooted in history. It starts out in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the recently enthroned king of Babylon, laid siege against Jerusalem. There's no doubt, scholars agree, this is 605 BC. This is the first siege against Jerusalem. This is when Daniel and his friends are taken captive. There will be a second siege in 597. That's when Ezekiel will be taken captive and brought to Babylon. And the third and final siege, in which the city of Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, is 586 BC. But as you look at Daniel chapter 1, that is the first thing that jumps out at you. As we go to verse 2, the Bible says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, that's Nebuchadnezzar's hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Now, as you think about this, it is almost shocking what God is doing here. So let's kind of work our way through it. The first point I want you to see, of a few important points, is that God is sovereign over history. God is the one who raises up kings and puts down kings. God is the one who does as he pleases in the armies of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. Our God is sovereign, and he's sovereign over history, and we see that right here. It wasn't chance or bad luck or something else that Jehoiakim, king of Judah, was defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. It was that the Lord gave him over. So point number 1, God is sovereign over all history. Point number 2 is you see this conflict. Between Jerusalem and Babylon. It's much bigger than that. It's a conflict between Yahweh and the false gods of Babylon. But it's even bigger than that. This is the age-old conflict. This is a conflict between Yahweh and Satan himself. And then number 3, as we read here in Daniel, as we advance the story of Daniel, you will see that what Yahweh is doing is much like what he did in Egypt. Just like he did with the Israelites when they were in Egyptian captivity and he showed up and we have the 10 plagues, the whole time what Yahweh was doing was showing to his people, showing to the Egyptians, showing to Pharaoh that he was the sovereign God. He was showing them that their gods were impotent while he was all-powerful. And that is exactly what we're going to see here. We're going to see Yahweh, his power, his majesty, on display and put up against the false gods of the Babylonians. And the false gods of the Babylonians can accomplish nothing. They can do nothing. But yet Yahweh is the one who does everything that he wants to, and he's doing it to show Nebuchadnezzar that he is God. He's doing it to show the Babylonian people, pagans, worshiping false God, that he is the true and living God. And he's doing it to remind his people who have strayed from him that he is the true and living God. So as you look at verse 2, the Lord did this, and they carried these articles, and they carried them into the land of Shinar, and brought these articles into the treasure house of God. Now, if you were with me last week, I made the case that quite possibly the Edamananke was actually nothing more than the Tower of Babel that had been left in ruins that Nebuchadnezzar cleaned up, refinished, and put that temple on the top of it. The reason we say that is because that's what it says in Genesis. In Genesis 11, verses 1 through 4, the Bible says, "Now the whole earth had one language and one speech." Again, this is post-flood. I think it's around 100 years. "And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. This is the Tower of Babel. This is where God confounded the languages." But what I want you to see is this was in the land of Shinar. And I would remind you that where Daniel finds himself is in the land of Shinar. That's where these articles were carried. That's why we believe that the Edamananke could indeed be the ancient ruins of the Tower of Babel that Nebuchadnezzar cleaned up, refinished, and put that temple on the top of. But whether that's true or not does not matter, but it is something that's quite possible. Now, these articles that were carried into the house of a false god of Nebuchadnezzar. It was either Nabu, the god he served, or Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. In either way, it does not matter, but it was one of the two. Now, a question is, why would God allow this? That's a great question, and one that's worthy of our discussion. Number one, the best place, the best commentary is probably right here that I've got up on the screen, 2 Chronicles 36:14 through 20, although it's all over the Old Testament. "Moreover, all the leaders of the priests and the people transgressed more and more, according to all the abominations of the nations. And they defiled the house of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. And the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand, and all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God down, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia." Why did God allow this? Because of sin. Because the nation had walked away from him. They should have seen what happened with Assyria and the northern tribes as a warning. But instead they continued in their sin, and judgment fell. So verse 3, the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of these children of Israel, king's descendants, nobles, young men, no blemish, good-looking, gifted in wisdom, possessing knowledge, quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, that he might teach them the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. He took the best and the brightest. He took the descent of the kings, those with no blemish, those who were intelligent and articulate. And they are the ones that he trained. And in this, we see three important points of what Nebuchadnezzar did, and they're easy to detect. First was he isolated. They were marched away from their family in many cases, but definitely once they got to Babylon, they were away from their family. They were now in the king's palace, surrounded by the king's men. They were completely isolated. That was the first part. Not only was there isolation, there was indoctrination. You see that as you look at verse 4. Young men in whom there was no blemish, they were quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and that he might teach them the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. The goal was not only isolation, but indoctrination, to cause them to forget everything about Judaism and to train them in everything they needed to know about Babylon and the Chaldean culture. So isolate, indoctrinate, but then assimilate. And we'll see that as he gives them new names. He wanted to make them completely Chaldean. He wanted to take these Jewish nobles' sons, these bright and articulate and intelligent men, and convert them into Chaldeans for his own use. Isolate, indoctrinate, and assimilate. And again, all this happened because of the sin of the nation. Verse 5, so the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine he drank, and 3 years of training. Can you imagine what that is like? He has appointed the food. Now they're in Babylon U for 3 years of intense Chaldean training with the ultimate goal. They're going to serve in the palace. They're going to serve the king. Verses 6 and 7, we see the final step in all of this as he renames them, as he assimilates them. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So I have on the screen their names, their meaning in Hebrew. So Daniel, God is my judge. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. And then their Babylonian names. Now the meaning of the Babylonian names we're not as sure about, but we're close here. Belteshazzar, meaning Bel, protect his life. So it was God is my judge. Now it's Bel, protect him. Hananiah, which was Yahweh is gracious, is now Shadrach, which means command of Aku. Mishael, who is what God is now Meshach, who is like Aku. And then finally Azariah, Yahweh has helped, is now Abednego, or servant of Nebo. You see, he has completely attempted to assimilate, to isolate, to indoctrinate. They are being brainwashed in Babylonian culture, in Babylon University. And again, there's no Babylon University, I'm just having fun. But you understand what Nebuchadnezzar's trying to do with these young men as he brings them into his culture that they might forget their culture. We come to verse 8 of chapter 1. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat of the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this manner, and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in the flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. Now this tells us a great deal about the character of these men, and it flows from the reality that Daniel had purposed in his heart that he did not want to defile himself. So the goals of Nebuchadnezzar were easy to detect, But Daniel's conduct is easy to uncover. Number one, purposed in his heart in advance not to defile himself. We don't know all that he was thinking. We don't know why he rejected the food. Was it because it violated kosher laws? Was it because it had been sacrificed to idols? Was it some combination thereof? We do not know, but whatever it was, Daniel recognized to eat it was to compromise. And he was not going to compromise. He was not going to defile himself. And that's point number one of Daniel's conduct. Point number two, he acted in boldness, but yet with great humility. Point three. So let's unpack number two. Here he is a captive, and he goes to the steward and says, hey, test us. Why do we have to eat this? In great boldness, but yet humility with a winsome character. That's point number three. He requested it. And where the chief eunuch only saw a win-lose scenario, Daniel provided a win-win scenario. Let's do a test. Let's do a 10-day trial run. And then you make a decision. And so this boy, this teenager who would become a man, purposed not to defile himself, acted in great boldness, yet so in humility, and he trusted God to show up and to show out. There's no reason eating vegetables are going to make you look better than the men who are eating the delicacies, unless you're doing it for the glory of God, unless you're asking God to show up and glorify himself and make his name great. And then indeed, you will prove to be healthier looking. And so Daniel's conduct is very easy. Notice verse 9, we see that God gave them favor. Again, that is a prayer I often pray. God, would you give me favor with these people at my work? God, would you give me favor in this situation with these people? And we see that's exactly what happened with Daniel. God gave him favor. That's why he could ask and get such an amazing request. You see that the chief eunuch was initially afraid. But again, we work through all that. And then verses 11 through 13, we have the plan to test them. Verse 14, the eunuch consents. And then as you and I might guess, verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in the flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's food. Thus the steward took away the king's diet and gave them vegetables and water only. What an amazing story so far. So let's continue to advance it in verses 17 through 21. As for these four young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. I would remind you, this is literature and wisdom that's, for the most part, pagan in its roots. This is Babylonian literature and wisdom. But they're going to glorify God, and God's going to give them knowledge and skill outside of just the Bible. And this is a good lesson for us. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, that would have been the 3 years, when the king had said to them that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19, then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. Of course none were found like them. God gave them knowledge and skill. In verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued unto the first year of King Cyrus. Thus he continued from 605 BC to 539 BC, with the kingdom changing hands and power rising and power falling. But this man of God who walked with God, but yet was a servant to his pagan kings, continued into the reign of King Cyrus. Verse 17, you can see God gave them knowledge. And again, I've said enough there. We can see that they brought before Nebuchadnezzar at the end of their 3-year time. He interviews them, and he finds nobody like them in all his realm. God grant us favor. God give us wisdom, that we may glorify not ourselves, that we may glorify you. Verse 21, for this reason, they're just elevated to all forms and places of leadership within the kingdom. So we said that Nebuchadnezzar's goals were easy to detect. We said that Daniel's conduct was easy to uncover, and God's responses are easy to see. Verse 15, he blessed them physically. Again, they were eating a diet of vegetables, maybe no protein or maybe some protein and water, God blessed them physically. So whether the diet was better or not better is not the point, I don't think. I think the point is when we're doing things to glorify God and not to glorify ourselves, He's going to bless us. He blessed them physically. He blessed their mental abilities in verse 20. Not just in understanding the Bible and not just in understanding deep things of God, but in understanding matters and wisdom and understanding related to the Chaldean culture. And Nebuchadnezzar found them better than his magicians and astrologers. He blessed them physically. He blessed their mental abilities. He blessed them spiritually. We see in verse 17 that Daniel had understanding in all visions and all dreams. A man blessed of God spiritually because he purposed in his heart. And then finally he blessed them, and this is amazing, socially. He gave them favor with all these pagan people. Again, what Nebuchadnezzar was up to was easy to see. How Daniel responded was easy to see. And what God did when He showed up and showed out in the life of these 4 teenagers who would become men is definitely easy to see as well, and serves as a good lesson for you and I. As we close the text this morning, and it's actually here this afternoon, how does this text point to Jesus? To the human eye, it appeared Nebuchadnezzar's god Nebo had won and Yahweh had lost. In fact, to the human eye, it appeared all was lost. Jerusalem had fallen to Nebuchadnezzar in 3 waves, 3 sieges. The choicest men, the choicest women, the choicest boys, and the choicest girls had either died during the siege, had died on the way of being taken captive to Babylon, or were now in Babylon, 500 miles away from Jerusalem as a crow flies, disconnected from the temple, which, by the way, has been destroyed. By the way, the articles in the temple have been taken to Babylon. From the human perspective, it looks like all is lost. But I would remind us, this all happened because of Judah's sin. This all happened because Judah was unwilling to repent and walk with Yahweh. Now, what the human eye could not see is God had another plan going on the entire time. He was sending some of His choicest soldiers, at least 4 that we know about, men who trusted Him, men who would obey Him, and He was sending them behind enemy lines into this massive 40-foot wall fortified pagan city of Babylon. And He was placing them around men and women. He was placing them in the life of Nebuchadnezzar so that Nebuchadnezzar could see what vibrant faith in Yahweh God looks like when it's lived out. He was placing them there so that God could show His power in their lives, so that God could make a declaration to Babylon, to Nebuchadnezzar, these are all false gods who are impotent. I am the true and living God who is all powerful. These 4 teenagers who would become men beautifully typify another Hebrew who will arrive in roughly 600 years from now. He too would travel to a foreign land to bear witness of the one true God. We know this Jew well. His mother, under command from the angel, named him Jesus. Like Daniel and his companions, Jesus left home, willing to embrace and interact with a sinful and hostile world, yet without defiling himself ever. Like these Hebrew boys, he found favor with God and man. As Nebuchadnezzar was amazed at the wisdom of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, even as a boy, Jesus' teachers, and later in his life, even his opponents, were amazed at his understanding and answers, so much so, he often left them speechless. You see, Jesus Christ is the greater Daniel. He's the greater Hananiah. He's the greater Mishael. He's the greater Azariah. Jesus refused to compromise when He faced the emperor behind the emperor, the king behind the king, Satan. Now, there's a certain irony in all this that's hard to miss. It is grace-filled and it is gospel-rich. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah will give a faithful witness before Ashpenaz and before Nebuchadnezzar, and will be brought to live in the king's palace. Jesus, in contrast, will give a faithful witness before Herod and Pilate, and he'll be nailed to a cross. Yet by His death, all who trust in Him will live forever with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords in His eternal palace. what a beautiful picture Daniel and his three friends are of the Lord Jesus Christ. I submit unto you Daniel chapter 1. Thank you.